We were the lucky country. We went camping on weekends. We played cricket in the park with the family. We spent time making memories that would last forever. Now we have lost our jobs, our homes, our businesses, and our lives. Our state and federal governments have taken our rights away, destroyed our freedoms, and have been ruling by decree in the name of safety. This is not the new normal. We will not watch our country be run by bureaucrats. We will stand up and we will fight back. It is time to mark the day that matters to every single Australian. That day is Freedom Day. On the 4th of December, we will rise for freedom over fear. We will demand an end to the lockdowns, an end to the state of emergency, and we will demand real leadership. The Liberal Democrats will rise for our day of freedom. We will rise to end the state of emergency. We will rise and take our country back. Will you rise with us on Freedom Day? Freedom Day, December 4, 2021. Join the fight for freedom. Join the Liberal Democrats.
Authorised J. Humphreys, Mount Weatherly, Victoria.
Welcome again to Liberty Chat, our weekly podcast for registered members and supporters of the Liberal Democrats, which we then, of course, put up on our social media so that everyone else can watch. And as of today, we've now set up on Podbean, so we'll spread the details about that later, and obviously we'll look at a few other channels after that. But we do welcome our regular panellist, Mr. David Limbrick MP here in Melbourne.
Hi, everyone.
We have Mr. Campbell Newman up there in beautiful Queensland.
Hi, all.
And as you can see from John's background full of crazy people, he is there in Sydney at his unofficial campaign launch. Hi, John. Turn your sound on.
Okay, can you hear us okay?
We can. Now, I just want to say that to everyone that's listening, they've had a couple of drinks already, I think.
Oh, yes. Okay, so can everybody here say a big cheer for the Liberal Democrats National Federal Campaign? Okay, so we're having a good time here. We've had IT problems, so we apologise for the delay. It's all the New South Wales team's fault.
Oh, well, we'd already blamed them, so that's fine. This is the first campaign launch party of the whole campaign season, so that's fantastic.
Yes. Oh, yeah, well, we've got terrific officers here, and we're a fantastic mood, and it's great to have met so many people that I've met over the Zooms over the last several months, and we've met them in person, but yeah, feel like I've met all my long-lost brothers and sisters.
I can see a few familiar faces in behind you as well.
And I want to introduce my wife, Kirsty. I want to introduce my wife to the team. So come here, Kel. Here she is. This is Kel.
Hello,
Kelly.
hello, how are you?
Hi, Kelly.
Hello, hi.
And I've already said to everyone that John is punching well above his weight there with his beautiful wife, Kelly.
No. I know, yes, I agree with it.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to actually let John go off and enjoy his little soiree. First time out in a little bit of freedom, I think. Don't worry, we do have a recorded offering of John's blistery history up soon. So bye everyone in Sydney, have a fun night.
Well, I just want to say to the New South Wales Police, who I understand a few of them watching, there's a lot of social distancing going on here tonight. Everybody is quadruple vaxxed, and so there's absolutely nothing to worry about what's happening here at the Liberal Democrats New South Wales Senate campaign launch.
Beautiful. Now, quick, cover up the screen. Hurry up.
You're on a list. Okay. You're on a list now.
We'll get booted off YouTube for that one.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll just wait. And then, so we've got another little record earlier that we did from the week from Satyajeet Marar. So we're going to now introduce Satya. Tonight, we also welcome Satyajeet Marar, a Washington-based policy commentator and analyst. He previously has worked here in Australia at the Centre for Independent Studies and at the Australian Taxpayer Alliance. He's also worked with Reason.com in the US, not the terrible political party that we have here. Welcome very much, Satya. You are our very first international guest to Liberty Chat.
Hey, good to be here.
Now, I know you've been obviously you can write about almost anything, but I know you were talking a little bit lately about some of the debt and increased spending that's just happening because of the COVID responses. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a general trend even before COVID of escalating debt to GDP levels in Australia and the US, in Western countries in general. We sort of abandoned the economic orthodoxy we had even 20 or 30 years ago when, both major parties in all our countries sort of agreed that in the long term, we need to be able to pay off our debt, run balanced budgets, and if not do that, then at least have sustainable levels of debt that aren't continuously increasing. I mean, if you have a look at the debt levels before World War II, there was certainly a lot of spending, but, it was paid off very quickly. And in the last 20 years or 30 years, it's just been climbing up and up and up. And COVID has accelerated that even further. There's a belief that as long as governments artificially keep the interest rates low through not governments, whoever runs the monetary policy, the Reserve Bank in the case of Australia, as long as the interest rates are kept low, it becomes, that debt becomes serviceable. But the problem is that what goes up must come down at some point, or in this case, what goes down must go up at some point. And unfortunately, when that does happen, I think we're going to see a very severe correction, especially in a country like Australia, where a lot of people are heavily leveraged into the property market.
Yes. And so particularly as a younger person yourself, how do you see that sort of playing out over the next few years in Australia in particular?
Not very good. I think there is a general sense amongst our generation that the bigger problem beyond the debt, which is concerning, is there's a perception that the real cost of living has climbed, and a lot of that is driven by the increase in the cost of housing and the cost of electricity and the cost of education as well. In the USA, it's especially strong, and I think what's in fact happening, it's affecting our politics. A lot of young people who would be liberals in college, 30 or 40 years ago, they would normally start paying taxes once they're into the workforce. They would start paying taxes, they'd start having a family and doing all that, and they would slowly move either to the center or they'd move towards the right. What's happening is the same people are thinking, well, a tax cut would be nice, but what would really help me is if I didn't have this huge student loan to pay off. So to them, that is a much bigger tax cut. If someone can cancel their debt, that's what Bernie Sanders, for example, has promised. I got friends of mine who are right-wing who've said, look, I don't think it's a good policy because it's kind of unfair to make people who haven't gone to college pay, effectively bear the burden of people who had that privilege. But hey, if the government's going to do that for me, then I'm not going to say no. You could call it sort of an accelerationist doomer mentality of, if the whole system's going to collapse, let me at least get something out of it.
Yeah.
A lot of millennials aren't having children, so maybe that's also factors into their long-term decision making.
It's true.
I mean, partly because of financial concerns, not just because we're all consumerists like we're portrayed to be sometimes. So yeah, it's concerning.
I was just going to say, on that note, we do actually have a question from one of our members, Paul, who says, what do you think is a more important number, debt to GDP ratio or the per capita debt?
I think you sort of need to have both, right? You can't necessarily discount one or the other. I think debt to GDP is probably a very good figure because it gives you a picture of the overall economy and how it's gone. You can go as far back as the 1800s, and because debt to GDP gives you a better measure than the sort of debt that isn't inflation adjusted, for example. It gives you a good idea of the ability of the economy in the long term to sort of pay for itself. In terms of per capita debt, I think that's a good figure just in terms of putting things in perspective, right? Because when you have a home loan or a student loan to pay off, you're consciously aware of how much debt you are paying off as an individual. But when we have a net debt figure for public debt that every taxpayer is bearing, I think it gives you it really brings home the fact that the debt the government owes is something you have to pay off in the long run using your taxpayer money. And also, I think it can be helpful in terms of giving people a reasonable perspective on things like immigration, because if the native population isn't having enough children, then really sustainable immigration, at the very least, is the only way you can, in the long term, afford to pay for pensions, to pay for healthcare, have new people coming in. So it's something that I think we need to have both, really.
Satya, can I ask, you're in Washington, correct?
Yep.
So just across the Potomac, you've got the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I'm in Virginia, actually, right across.
Virginia. Right,
Yeah.
okay. And they have unusually, whereas most states have an election every 2 years on even year numbers, Virginia has a governor's race in the off year. I think New Jersey does as well. Now, Virginia used to be, a very solid Republican state. Voted for George W. Bush twice, then voted for Obama narrowly, and people thought that was a sort of a one-off in 2008. But it just seems to have sort of become more and more Democrat with every election. And I'm guessing that's because a lot of the public servants are spilling out into Virginia. So I think the election's next Tuesday, your time, Wednesday, our time. The polls are close. It seems like I'm following it. I'm following it because it looks as though it's going to be a litmus test on what the American public thinks about COVID overreach. So you're on the ground. I'd be keen to see what you think about that governor's race.
Yeah, sure. I actually don't think it's, so much COVID overreach. In fact, I think you can see the difference when you move from DC to Virginia, even right now. So DC, you have to wear a mask indoors, even though almost all of DC is vaccinated. Not almost all, but above 85% are vaccinated. Whereas Virginia, you can go where you want to. Generally, you don't have to wear a mask. Some places like 7-Eleven have a private policy about mask wearing. You compare that in New York to, I mentioned DC, but New York is even worse. I was in New York City recently. Even though the people there are now confident in going outdoors and there are crowds outside because most people are vaccinated, you have to show a vaccine pass in most venues when you go there. Not a problem for me, but for a lot of people who haven't been jabbed, that means you're basically shut out of what New York has to offer you. So Virginia has generally been sort of okay in terms of the COVID stuff. With that being said, I think one of the big issues that's made a big difference has to do with education and schooling, and it's become a huge culture issue, and it's revealed a lot of problems in the US schooling system, really. So in the US, teachers' unions are incredibly powerful entities, and over time they've become political entities, more so than being run, in my opinion, for the benefit of many teachers. For example, they will fight hard on things like benefits for members or creating more teaching positions, whereas a lot of you survey individual teachers, many of them will say we'd rather just have a salary hike, we don't need more benefits. Often a lot of the teachers' pension funds are not going to be solvent, is what the analysis is now showing. But a big problem has arisen now around a lot of culture war type of issues. So around things like critical race theory and the teaching of that in schools. There's a big fight for things like school choice, being able to take your child to school or to homeschool them if you believe that you want more control over the education. My personal opinion is, look, parents should have more power over what their kids are taught. Education begins at home.
They're also even calling parents who have issues with some of the school board policies, they're calling them domestic terrorists.
Yeah, so
it's really quite insane. Yeah.
So there's a huge clash now between these school boards, and teachers' unions have disproportionate power in terms of running local elections. Yes. So there's a disproportionate imbalance of power between the people influenced by the teachers' unions, that sort of establishment, who tend to be more liberal leaning, and the parents who aren't necessarily liberal or right leaning, but they have certain interests which are being, in my opinion, put down by the system. And this became absolutely clear recently. Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat candidate, he explicitly came out and said, because a lot of his support comes from groups like teachers' unions, he has to side with them. He said that it's not up to parents to shape their kids' curriculum.
Yes.
Now, what does that tell you as a parent? Whether you're Democrat or Republican, it tells you, hey, that doesn't sound right. Something's off with them.
They do always make a lot of excellent content for that libs of TikTok, that excellent Twitter page to follow. Those teachers over there really do come up with some excellent content.
Yeah, absolutely. And right after he made that statement, because John, like you said, Virginia has been leaning blue increasingly. It's not just due to public servants, also big cities like big metro areas like DC, which have now spilled over into Virginia, tend to lean liberal. It's not just that. Yeah, so it's a combination of that and public servants being concentrated around the area, and government contractors and so on. But as soon as Terry McAuliffe made that statement, they did an opinion poll, I believe, a day later or just days later. And all of a sudden, the race is neck and neck. 48% show support for Glenn Youngkin, who's a Republican candidate, 48% for Terry McAuliffe. And interestingly, if you narrow it down to parents with children in school, it switches to 56% support for Youngkin and a much lower support, obviously, for McAuliffe. So there's 1 week left now. It's still anybody's race. But if this doesn't send a message that you have to take parents seriously and give them some more control over their kids' education, respect the family unit, I'm not sure what does.
That's right. Now, Satya, what are your thoughts? I know you've written about this as well before, your thoughts about the rising power or even the rising threat of China.
Yeah, look, I have no problem, as most people don't, with the idea of China becoming prosperous, pulling people out of poverty, embracing global markets, trading with us to our mutual advantage. Awesome, great stuff. And, for all the people who say that we just don't like China because they're successful, there was no big problem 10 years ago. I mean, yeah, their human rights record is absolutely horrible. The way they treat the Taiwanese, the Tibetans, and the Uyghurs, inexcusable. But, we trade with a lot of countries that have a pretty bad history with how they treat minorities. And, for China to be like that, let's be very clear about this. While we criticize them as we should for how they treat people in those parts of China, and in the case of Taiwan, an independent sovereign state, that isn't the reason why we are now clashing with them the way we are. We're clashing with them because they're trying to economically coerce and bully us. And they've been using one-sided, underhanded tactics for a long time, which the Western world has sort of allowed to let slide. They've resorted to industrial espionage, IP theft. And keep in mind, this is a different thing, like a particular Chinese company behaving badly. Chinese companies are accountable directly to the Chinese state. It's there in Chinese law. Huawei, for example, is a national champion. It relies heavily on government subsidies that have allowed it to undercut its competitors in other countries by up to 70% in terms of bidding for sensitive infrastructure contracts, like building out 5G networks. And under Chinese law, they have to assist the Chinese government in state surveillance. Plus, once your country is signed up to the 5G network run by Huawei, you have a liability because you have to rely on China. They have huge leverage over you, because you have to rely on them for continued upgrades to that network and contracts going forward. So, for them, there's this big, in a liberal democracy like Australia or the US, there tends to be some level of detachment between the economic goals of individuals and the political goals of the state. In China, that detachment almost disappears completely. The only way you can be truly wealthy in China is if you have a good relationship with a one-party state, which is the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes.
If you're wealthy, it's really because they're allowing you to be, no matter how brilliant you might actually be. I mean, we saw this with Jack Ma. I mean, they had to punish him because he made the mistake of openly criticizing them quite fairly, I thought. He wasn't even personal about it, and he was disappeared for, I think, a few months. And his wealth, the wealth of his company was cut. The message was absolutely clear. So what have they done to Australia? Well, they have gotten angry because we refused to let them build out a sensitive infrastructure through Huawei. They've demanded that we give them the contract as a condition of resuming normal negotiation. This is a standover tactic. Can you imagine if Telstra went to China and said, "Hey, let's build out your NBN. We'll do an NBN for China. How about that?" You'd be laughed out of the bloody room, right out of the country. And they've demanded that we allow Victoria, which is a state government, to enter into an open-ended, questionable deal with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is part of their geopolitical strategy of shutting out their rivals, including India, as part of the Sea of Pearls and all of that. So they're demanding as a basic condition of normal relations, the terms that they would never even dream of accepting if we ask that from them. They're trying to strong arm Australia because they think they can. They won't do this to the US because they know the US can bite back a lot harder. So, it's bullying tactics. And what we really need now is for Australia to find common ground with European countries, with India, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and the US. We don't have to agree. Our interests are very different from each of these countries. But if we can agree on one thing, which is coming together on the key issues where China is trying to manipulate the rules of the road unfairly. For example, to take them to task at the WTO, which is happening right now over their economic coercion, over their tariffs and so on. Take them to task for trying to unduly influence the standard-setting bodies for things like intellectual property around telecommunication network and so on. I think that'll be to our advantage. And it doesn't mean that we have to breach the principles of free trade. If anything, it supports free trade. It means that we're preventing them from having undue control or breaking the rules of the road that allow everyone to mutually benefit. I only hope that in the future, after Xi Jinping is gone, hopefully, we'll have a Chinese leader who's a little more like Deng Xiaoping or Hu Jintao, who is willing to be, less wolf warrior and more friendly, because that's what we want. We want to be friends with other countries.
John, have you got any more questions for Satya before we say goodnight?
Well, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the 2024 presidential election. I noticed on Betfair about 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump became the favourite to be the next president, ahead of Biden and ahead of Kamala, and his lead is only growing. So, I did think that he was, he didn't have a political future in him, but it's starting to look like, we might be on the verge of the greatest comeback since the resurrection of Jesus Christ here.
Look, I wouldn't descend into borderline blasphemy. But, look, "Let's Go Brandon" is now, I believe, the top trending song on iTunes. So
it is.
But keep in mind, Joe Biden got elected on the back of a huge anti-Trump vote, because a lot of people who were not activated in 2016 became activated in 2020. I still think it's anyone's race. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Trump will win the nomination. He probably will, almost certainly, but I don't think it's set in stone yet, because anything can change in the next 3 years.
I think it's 100% certain. As long as Trump's health holds up, I think it's a 100% certainty that he'll be the Republican nominee if he wants to be. Well, someone will run against him. Someone like a Kasich or someone will run against him, but he'll win. It's just a question of will he win the election?
Look, even 1 year before the 2016 election, it didn't look like Trump was going to come out of nowhere and take over completely. And 2 years before, people like Trump, the idea of Trump running was a complete joke.
Yes.
Anything can happen in politics. I firmly believe that. I quite like the rising stars at the moment, like Ron DeSantis in Florida. He's been amazing. He's overall, I don't agree with him on everything, but on almost everything, he's excellent. He's very solid champion for freedom on the whole. Kirsty O'Sullivan in North Dakota or South Dakota, I forget which one. A few others. And the thing is, I don't know for sure if Trump can win the general election. I think he probably will get the Republican nomination. I do think, though, that in terms of a general election, in terms of winning over people who are somewhere close to center, I think that someone like Ron DeSantis would have a better chance of doing that than someone like Trump. How that plays out is an open question. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that voters are closer to the middle. They tend to make a pretty huge difference. Most Americans aren't as polarized as we're led to believe. They might end up picking someone who is like Trump in many ways, like DeSantis is, but who seems to be a little less of a wild card, a little less chaotic. Someone who you don't have to pick up the newspaper and read something either intentionally or unintentionally hilarious every day. So let's see what happens.
Yeah. Well, Satya, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know it's past 11 p.m. over there where you are, so I'm sure you'll be tucked off to bed right now. Thanks again, Satya.
Good to see you, Satya.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.
Good.
Well, that was great. There were a few people asking questions for Satya in there, and unfortunately that was a pre-record. We had to do him a couple of days ago in the afternoon because of the time frame. There was a 15-hour delay for Washington. Now, before we go to our next guest, I think it's time to get a bit of an update of the goings-on that David Limbrick has been doing. It's been pretty exciting. We've had a lot of media about it, and I even went and checked it out myself yesterday. David, tell us about Rebel Parliament and what you did today.
Yeah, so for those of you that have been following me, you'll know that Parliament voted to kick out members of Parliament, of its own Parliament, who refused to hand over their vaccination papers. And that happened in both the lower house and upper house in Victoria. And Tim and I, along with two other members of Parliament in the upper house, refused to hand over our papers, and we got suspended from Parliament. And we decided that we would continue Parliament, but we'd do it remotely. And so we set up a Parliament in exile, or our secret rebel base, in a nightclub. at the Chase Lounge nightclub on Queen Street. So, you know, nightclubs aren't doing much at the moment. They're closed and shuttered, and the very kind people at Chase Lounge let us set up, and they had a great big projector screen that we put the live stream from Parliament on, and we did media from there, and we did heaps of media. Actually, I think it was one of the biggest media weeks for the Liberal Democrats we've ever had. I ended up going on Sky News twice. We were featured on Channel 9 News, ABC News. We were on Ruction's live stream. We ended up on Rebel News. We went nuts all over social media, and we ended up reaching millions of people in the end, all around the world. So that was fun. But we made our point. But one of the things that's also happened this week is the pandemic legislation, which many people will be aware of, this draconian new bill that's come through. It went through the lower house this week. My office also has been, was attacked. We're not sure whether it was attacked by, I don't know, just a random vandal, or it was a political attack. But the day after they put through the motion to suspend us, my office, someone turned on a fire hydrant and destroyed it. So I don't have an office, and I'm unlikely to have an office for some time. So I've got some extra office space at Parliament, but it basically means that I need to prepare for this battle that's going to happen in the next sitting week, which will be in the middle of November. And if I don't have either an elected office or I can't get into Parliament, I'm not going to be able to fight it, and I'm not going to be able to vote. So Tim and I made the decision today. We listened to our supporters. I know many of our members have contacted me and said, we understand your point, but please go back to Parliament. And I had thousands of supporters contact me as well with emails with the same effect. We listened, we handed in our papers today. I'm back in Parliament and we're ready to do battle. But look, I think we made our point. They didn't get away with it without the media knowing what happened, and it was fun. Like, we went into, you know, Parliament from a nightclub. I think the Liberal Democrats now have set up the first Parliament in exile in a nightclub in world history. So,
I did love the neon sign that was in there, and right above where Tim was sitting, actually saying, "You can't sit with us."
Yeah.
So cool.
I made a joke on Paul Murray that they should have put it above my seat in Parliament. So I'm still bitter and twisted about being voted out. Now, to his credit, the only person that didn't vote to kick us out was Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party. So he's obviously one of the smartest people in Parliament. The Liberal Party voted to kick us out along with the Labor Party. So, yeah, I'm pretty upset with them. Although Bernie Finn did, I don't know, he must have hurt his leg on the way to the vote or something. He didn't turn up to vote for that. But
it's conveniently not in the room.
Yeah, he did speak very strongly against what they were doing, to his credit. But it's absolutely outrageous what they've done. It's a horrifying precedent. We had to show some sort of dissent, and we did that. I think we made our point, but we're going back into battle now. So yeah, I mean, that's it. And yeah, this new pandemic legislation, it's nuts. Look, you know, the government, the way that they do this sort of stuff is they come out and they say, you know, with these new bills and stuff, and it's really horrible. And then everyone gets upset about it. And then a couple of the crossbenchers that they're friendly with, they say, oh, we're going to do these amendments. And then the government agrees to the amendments. And then the government actually waters it down a tiny bit and gets what they originally wanted anyway.
Yes.
We know how they work. We know how they operate. We're not stupid anymore. So, you know, that's exactly what's going to happen. People are already talking about amendments to it and stuff, but it is absolutely horrifying legislation. You know, not recklessly disobeying, you know, aggravated, it's an aggravated offence to disobey a health order. You can go to jail for 2 years, can you believe? 2 years or $90,000 fine. Like, it's absolutely incredible. The Premier can extend a state of emergency as long as he wants, basically. It's got some powers of detention without review. It's absolutely horrifying from a civil liberties point of view. And
I note, David, it's being opposed by some prominent QCs in the media in the last 24 hours. Yeah.
I can't find anyone who's not part of the Labor Party or controlled by them that does support it. Like actually serious question, like if there is anyone out there that thinks it's a good idea, I'd be interested to read their justification of it. But the only people supporting it that I'm aware of are, either Labor Party and their supporters, or, the Greens came out and said it's pretty good, which was stupid. They got totally trashed on social media.
Michael Danby, Labor or ex-Labor MP, was quite good on Sky about it.
I saw that.
Yeah, and it was
I
interesting.
actually saw that interview, yeah.
He was saying about, a lot of them are they're saying yes to follow on with what Dan says because they want to keep their jobs, and we understand that. They're wanting to, continue on with the pre-selection for the state next year. And that's, to me, is just abhorrent, that they'd put their job over all of their constituents, because I know I've heard from many previous Labor voters or people in different constituencies of Labor, and they're ringing them and saying, what are you doing? We don't want this. So they are not listening to their own voters and their constituents as well. It's quite appalling.
The feedback that I get is they never even get a response. So,
yeah.
Look, I mean, in fairness, I'm getting, like, my inbox at the moment has about close to 2,000 unread emails, right? So it's unreasonable to expect my small team to respond to every one of those individually. We are collecting them and sorting them, and we will provide a response as best we can. And I imagine the Labor MP's offices are just the same. Now, I don't know whether they're going to respond or not. I can't speak to them.
Yes.
But look, I think that, like, there's a comment in here about the Greens have all lost all credibility in regards to human rights. Absolutely. I don't let them talk about human rights anymore without calling it out, because they're enablers of human rights abuses as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
We are the only party really that has consistently defended the rights of Victorians and will continue to do so. And we hold steadfast on that. We're not going to budge.
Exactly. Righto. Well, I think it's time to bring in our very second special guest. And we have Mr. Tom Switzer, a new member of the Liberal Democrats, and he's also the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies. Welcome, Tom.
Welcome, Tom.
Hey, David, Kirsty and Campbell, great to be with you.
Now, you had a very excellent article published in the Wall Street Journal today. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, really, it gets back to what the Queen said recently. Queen Elizabeth said, it's really irritating when they talk but don't do. And that was widely perceived in our media as a criticism of the Morrison government for talking the talk about decarbonising our economy but not doing much. But really what she meant was, of course, with the major emitters like China and India and Russia. China is escalating its coal production. And of course, Russia is in the process of building a massive pipeline to supply Germany with gas. And what's happening here, of course, is that while the West, including Australia, is decarbonising our economies, developing countries like China and India are chugging along the smoky path to prosperity. And they're not going to reduce their carbon footprint. And this means that, climate summits like that at Glasgow is just talk. It's all hot air. And I think it's a sign that the whole process of decarbonising the economy is just unrealistic, but also it's also irresponsible.
I see what you did there, Tom. It's all hot air.
The trouble is that this thing gets a life of its own. So Morrison goes, he presents his plan, which he released this week, which I'd encourage participants tonight to have a look at, because it is just a marketing document. It is just quite pathetic, and obviously not to release the modelling speaks volumes. But the point is, he makes the announcement, he'll come back and say, he thinks he's appeasing people who want this to happen. Trouble is, he's not going to make them happy. There'll be more that they'll want. They'll want faster, harder, higher targets. And the trouble is, internationally as well, we've actually weakened our position, Tom. That's what I think. It's that because there'll be more. I've been sort of, in a light-hearted way, ridiculing this whole thing with a bit of a social media video I put out at the barbecue, talking about no gas, pointing at the Barbie, no coal. And by the way, he's going to a conference. The Prime Minister's going to a conference and participating with people who seriously are talking about saying, well, we can't eat as much meat, or we've got to ban meat. I mean, you're just washing away the foundations. I think firmly, call me an optimist, but to even have such an idea, I think he should have just said, no, this is bullshit. And by the way, for the Secretariat, please don't edit that out, when it goes live. This is bullshit. We're just simply not going to play this game. And perhaps, again, Tom wants to talk a bit more about what's actually happening in China and India and Indonesia and Vietnam and all these countries.
Well, the cold hard reality is that 65% of global emissions are coming from the non-OECD. And all the available evidence says that energy consumption will increase by 50% during the course of the next 30 years. And it's the developing world that wants to fuel that increase in energy. And, I've said this time and again on various media outlets, but you can't blame the leaders of these developing countries. They want to grow their economies. They want to reduce poverty. They want to increase their living standards. And for the foreseeable future, the cheapest way of doing that is on the back of carbon energy. And, the West got rich as a result of industrialization. The developing world is catching up. And here we are, in a way, trying to impose a form of colonialism on the developing world by dictating to them how they should use their energy, when, frankly, the energy transition will take a lot longer than 30 years. It will happen, but it won't happen in our lifetimes unless there's a massive technological breakthrough, and there's no evidence for that. So as I point out in the Wall Street Journal, guys, the developing world want to get rich, and the cheapest way of doing that for the foreseeable future is on the back of carbon energy. And that's why you're not going to get a legally binding, verifiable and enforceable deal. And, this is amazing. Morrison is incredible. He's betrayed his base, particularly in Queensland. All those quiet Australians that he won in the 2019 election campaign, they're disappointed in him. But has he won any new friends on the left?
No.
Not at all. Listen to the ABC this week. Every story has been hammering him for not doing enough.
That's right.
I've got a bit of a theory about this, Tom, and other panelists. I think it's like this, that he gets the polling from Crosby Textor, and it's saying, 75 or 80% of people are tuned into net zero. They want something to happen, and they think then they're on a winner. The first observation I'd make is that 75, 80% support is actually soft. If someone had the guts, and he clearly doesn't, had the guts to say, look, this is the cost that comes to you and your family or your job, immediately that will start to melt, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is exactly what you said, Tom. It doesn't move any votes with obviously Greens, with the Labor Party. They think it's going to move votes in the middle. I don't think so. I really don't think so, because there's again a welter of criticism from the Greens and the Labor Party and the ABC that it's not enough.
Yeah.
Then what's going on is what I'm seeing, where I'm getting the emails, I'm getting the messages off my website, but I'd ask people to, whenever there's an article in the Australian newspaper about net zero, particularly one by Paul Kelly, say about Morrison, go down and read the comments. They're running 85, 90% against Morrison, and they are vitriolic, and it's all about betrayal. And
that's who in federal parliament is representing them other than the Liberal Democrats, Campbell? Seriously, maybe Newman and Hanson to some extent, but I mean, you're going to be running in the Queensland State Senate, and you're going to be up against Amanda Stoker, who's a sharp and smart lady, but she's going to have to wear this policy of net zero emissions. But the real problem here is that no one's prepared to raise the issue that our friend in Melbourne, David Limbrick, has raised, and that, of course, is nuclear energy, right, David?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like this net zero thing, right? I think that people really downplay Australia's contribution to low carbon energy throughout the world. You can look up the stats on our uranium exports. If you look at the energy, the electricity generated by our uranium exports, it's almost exactly equivalent to the amount of energy generated by our entire electricity grid. So we are enabling the world to produce zero carbon energy equivalent to our entire electricity production in this country through our uranium exports. That's a wonderful achievement for the planet, right? Clean energy for the planet through Australia's exports. But even though we enable this low carbon energy throughout the world, we don't use it ourselves. And as others here tonight have pointed out, Australia, in the scheme of things, we're just flotsam and jetsam on the scheme of things, right? Like we don't, you know, we're not China, we're not the United States, we're not India. We're a small country in the scheme of things, and we act as if, you know, what we do locally affects the world. But really, all that we can do in affecting the world is to send a signal. And the most powerful signal that we could send to the rest of the world is to legalize nuclear energy and say this is an option that we're going to put on the table, and everyone else should put it on the table too. That would send a very strong signal to the rest of the world.
We are not a climate laggard, Kirsty. We also often are told by the media that Australia, under various conservative governments, is a climate laggard. It's complete nonsense.
That's right.
I mean, you know, 1 in 4 households have rooftop solar. That's a world record.
Wow.
15% of our energy comes from renewables. The global average is about 4%. So, but, you know, Morrison's just being scared by this campaign, and admittedly, it's the capital markets, financial institutions. They've changed their tune. They're discriminating against fossil fuels. But look, the cold, hard reality is that the world will not be able to be powered by renewables in our lifetimes unless there's a massive technological breakthrough.
I think I should add, for participants who haven't sort of seen the policy yet, but I mean, just making a point that, you know, we did, as a party, put a stake in the ground the other day, and we are publicly supporting nuclear energy. So I think that's a really important thing. I'm fascinated, by the way, Tom, that David, that the PM just didn't have the guts after he back, you know, getting nuclear powered submarines. He immediately ruled it out. It was a golden moment, and you know.
Well, I make the point in the Wall Street Journal today that you know, I think in some respects Morrison, his U-turn on net zero is not just driven by the capital markets and concerns about former safe Liberal metropolitan seats in Sydney and Melbourne, you know, like Kooyong and Higgins and North Sydney, where I live. But it's also AUKUS. I mean, Canberra's AUKUS partners are the United States, Joe Biden, and Great Britain, Boris Johnson, and they've invested heavily in the whole idea of unilateral decarbonisation. But that will ultimately mean a weakened West, and that only helps a rising China that is addicted to coal. I mean, do you think the Chinese are going to power their aircraft carriers with wind and solar?
You raise a really good point, Tom, as well, like the strategic implications here. We must be cognizant of these strategic implications. And one of the big problems with renewables, I've got nothing against renewables, by the way. I think they're totally fine. Like, you know, I'm open to all energy sources.
They're out the window behind me, David.
Yeah.
Across the roofs behind
Mind you, David, if they're so cheap, why do they require ever higher government subsidies?
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, that's a very good point. And I don't think that they should be subsidised at all. But whoops, my thing's gone dark. But it's not powered by solar.
Full body scan.
But the problem here is, like, with many of these technologies, they have a very limited lifespan. So solar and wind turbines, you know, they last for 20 to 30 years. They're nearly all produced in China. They're produced with rare earth production in China. Many of these materials are produced with questionable supply chain. You know, like lots of the polysilicates used in solar panels come from Xinjiang province, where we know that there's problems with forced labor of Uyghurs and things like this. And we're by doing these things, like installing lots and lots of these panels and turbines, we're locking ourselves into a long-term subscription and dependence on a foreign power that maybe doesn't have our best interests at heart. And we have totally the opportunity using our own natural resources and to develop our own technology industry. We do have a nuclear industry in Australia. It's very small scale, but very, very skilled people in the Lucas Heights reactor in Sydney, some of the best in the world, you know, they make medical isotopes and do all sorts of research. There's no reason we couldn't expand that and become energy independent. We have other energy sources like gas and coal and these sort of things, but you know, locking ourselves into dependence on a foreign power like this is very dangerous strategically, I think.
Tom, just would like you to comment, if you would, please, on the whole hydrogen thing that's now being talked up by every damn politician on every street corner.
Yeah.
I'm very sceptical, because I'll say why. Because the idea of people in Canberra or George Street, I should say William Street in Brisbane, sort of being able to restructure our economy and create a whole new industry by diktat from above, it's sort of like it's 1930s Stalinist Russia, and it's the next fifth-fold 5-year plan. You know, again, I just have this urge to call out bullshit every time I hear about hydrogen.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, and Twiggy Forrest, of course, has been one of the biggest supporters of hydrogen. But we've got to remember, in the Australian context, you know, I said 14-15% of our energy is renewable, and then we rely heavily on coal, gas, and oil. But the other minor, we don't have nuclear, despite the fact, as David mentioned, we have huge uranium reserves, but we don't have much hydropower. We've got 5%, if that. And the idea that this can somehow be transformed in the course of just a decade or so is fanciful. I mean, remember, technological solutions are not yet proven commercially. And what's really striking me about this debate, everybody, is that in Australia, over the last month, when we've been obsessed about, well, the media's been obsessed about net zero emissions, look at how international investors are looking at Europe right now. I mean, Europe's got soaring energy prices. It's got a severe shortage of energy. They're overly reliant on Putin's gas. And of course, there's now a scramble back to baseload power. The first half, I made this point on the ABC the other day, much to the shock of my Radio National colleagues, but in the first half of 2021, coal became the biggest contributor to the electricity grid in Germany. And that's because they've shut down their nuclear reactors. They haven't got reliable and affordable renewable.
Yep.
And so they're now heavily reliant on not just Putin's gas, but on domestic brown coal. Ponder that.
Okay, can I throw in too something, just so people know about the hypocrisy of the Democrats in the US to that end? Obama came here for G20 7 years ago, and he gave a speech at the University of Queensland, which had people sort of queuing and ahhing and carrying on. And he particularly was pointed about the Great Barrier Reef and our coal industry. And as Premier at the time, I was furious. And a day or two later, when the people had all departed, I put in a call to the US ambassador and gave it to him, both barrels. And I particularly gave him then the results of the research that I dug up, which during the period of Obama's presidency, coal exports from US East Coast ports, export coal, had gone through the roof, double-digit increases every year. And where was it going? Into Europe. And you know what's happened while Biden's been president the last year? It's still going up.
Exactly.
So the Americans are literally gearing up in the Appalachians, sending coal to Europe. And you know, we should, when our PM's there, if he had any guts, he'd be sort of he'd be pulling the eggs up.
Well, just as a footnote to that, the Obama administration at Copenhagen in 2009 and then in Durban in 2011 signed an agreement. It wasn't, of course, legally binding because that would require 2/3 of the Senate ratification, which of course would never happen. But the Obama administration signed on to an idea that the OECD, the developed world, every year from 2020 would give $100 billion US to the developing world to help China and the non-OECD transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Now, Biden, who's essentially got control of both the houses, both the House and the Senate, he won't be able to get anything like that through. And if the Americans, in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis, can't find that kind of money, how will all these debt-fueled countries in the West find the money over the next decade to dole out to developing countries to make that transition? It's just pie in the sky stuff, guys.
Well, gentlemen, I am going to have to call a little bit of time out on this now. Wonderful conversation, though, very interesting. I am just mindful of the time, but thank you very much, Tom Switzer, and welcome to the Liberal Democrats. And of course, if you are listening to this and you are interested in becoming a member of the Liberal Democrats, please do go to our website, ldp.org.au, where you can join, you can donate to any campaign causes. You can also sign up to volunteer. We also have our Freedom Day petition still up there as well. But thank you very much, Tom Switzer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, David Campbell. Thank you.
Right. Well, once again, we do have another pre-record because, as we saw earlier, John Ruddick was at some soiree in Sydney whilst we're here working away for the cause. So we, of course, want to bring you blistery history. Now it is time for what is becoming a very firm favourite in the weekly Liberty Chat, and that is John's blistery history. John, what have you got for us tonight?
George Reid, in my view, Australia's greatest political figure. He was Australia's greatest freedom fighter when it came to intellectual battles and fighting for political freedom. Now, he was a Prime Minister of Australia, but he was actually, sadly, quite an inconsequential Prime Minister. He had two other great achievements, and I'll walk you through them. Now, George Reid was born in the UK. He came to Australia in the 1850s. His father was a very liberal-minded Presbyterian minister. When George Reid left school early, but he was a voracious reader. And the big issue in 19th century politics at the time was the protectionist versus the free trade debate. George Reid read enormously, and he was a very hard-working person professionally as well. And when he was 30, he wrote 5 essays about the glory of free trade. And the Prime Minister of England at the time, William Gladstone, who's one of the great figures of the British Empire, he happened to read these 5 essays about free trade. George Reid was somebody with zero public profile, and William Gladstone wrote to this young guy in colonial Australia and said, "These essays are fantastic. I encourage you to take out a political career."
Wow.
So that's right. About a decade later, he challenged Sir Henry Parkes for pre-selection. And he beat him because he was such a magnificent speaker. It was said at the time that George Reid was the greatest platform speaker in the British Empire. He was extremely funny, and the thing across George Reid's career, the people loved him, but the political establishment hated his guts, like they often do to libertarians, because we're good and they're bad. And so George Reid then becomes the Premier of New South Wales in about 1895. And he ended up being the longest serving premier up until his time. And he really championed free trade and low taxes and business. And he got re-elected in a big way. And he was a very popular, a superhero, and a big success. Now, at this stage, we had the situation in Australia of the federation debate. Now, federation was a movement that was pushed by the protectionists in Melbourne. And Melbourne was a very, very wealthy part of the empire at that stage. Melbourne in the 1890s was the second biggest city in the entire British Empire behind London, which is pretty impressive for a city which was 13 shacks in 1850 before the gold was found. So federation was very much a political battle between protectionist Melbourne and free trade New South Wales. And protectionist Melbourne went and got the other smaller states to unite behind them. So it was the other states really versus New South Wales and really against George Reid and his free trade agenda. George Reid was very ambivalent about free trade for quite a period of time because he says, look, this is going to damage our free trade principles and our free trade success. So then what happened was we had a referendum across the 6 colonies. The other 5 colonies said, yes, let's unite. Let's have a big federation. But New South Wales voted no. because of George Reid's ambivalence. And then they redid the Constitution. They had this thing called the secret premiers meeting in Melbourne, where George Reid turned up to. They all hated his guts because he's the guy that they all wanted their federation. George Reid says, well, we'll agree to federation if you amend that draft constitution you've got and you decentralize power and and all these good things. Now, he was still not thrilled with that constitution, and he was right about what's imperfect about it. But anyway, they had another referendum the next year, and this one did get up. The city of Sydney voted no on 2 occasions to joining the federation because they wanted to remain free trade, and they were concerned that federation would sort of engulf them through protectionism. But anyway, so then they had now George Reid should have been the first Prime Minister of Australia, and he was on track to being the first Prime Minister of Australia because the Australians were very much copying the Canadian precedent, which when they left England and became a nation, they had to appoint the first Prime Minister, and they simply appointed the Premier of the largest province in Canada. And people in New South Wales said, well, we'll do the same thing. So George Reid was the very popular Premier of New South Wales. And then people like Alfred Deakin and Edmund Barton played really disgusting political games, and they knifed George Reid, so he was taken out, and that's why he wasn't the Prime Minister. Now, he wanted to make the Commonwealth this free trade, low tax powerhouse, which would have been fabulous. Anyway, but he took it gracefully, and they have a federal election 2 or 3 months after Federation. So this is March 1901. They have a federal election. Everybody's against George Reid, but he actually almost won. And the Free Traders pretty much got control of the Senate. So he's in a strong position. Edmund Barton's the Prime Minister. He was pretty useless as a Prime Minister. And then and George Reid was on track to win the second election, but then they got rid of Edmund Barton, and then Alfred Deakin became the Prime Minister. Now, Alfred Deakin was really the Prime Minister of this country for the first 10 years. There were a few other Prime Ministers here and there, because I think there was about 7 Prime Ministers in the first 10 years, but it was always Alfred Deakin in control. And the story, and so George Reid's 18 months as Prime Minister was inconsequential. But the interesting thing is this, the other great achievement of George Reid is that the story of that first decade of Australian politics is the rise of the Labor Party. At the first federal election, Labor Party came a very distant third. As the elections kept unfolding, Labor's vote goes up and up and up. Now, the protectionists and the free traders hated each other's guts. But George Reid saw this incoming Labor tide, and George Reid said to the protectionists, he says, look, I know we disagree on a lot, but we've got this Labor Party over here, which are hardcore socialists. They were Christian socialists, but they really believed in nationalising industry, no private property. So George Reid said to the protectionists, he said, look, we've got to unite because at least we believe in private property.
Yeah.
And the protectionists who hated George Reid, they said, look, they eventually said in 1909, they said, okay, we will unite, but you, George Reid, the price is you've got to get out of Parliament, okay, out of the personal animosity. And George Reid said, look, if that's necessary, that's what I'll do. And so they started this thing called the Commonwealth Liberal Party, which is really the foundation of today's Liberal Party.
Wow.
George Reid went to live in England for the rest of his life after that, became the High Commissioner.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I know that Zach Gorman, who's one of Australia's certainly best young political historians, he's always said that George Reid is his favourite Prime Minister, and I never actually asked why. And I know that so much so that they even named their firstborn child Reid in honour of George Reid, which is quite amazing. So he finished up his career and life in the UK, so in England.
Well, a huge position at that time was the Prime Minister, but probably the second most powerful position in the country at the time was the High Commissioner to London. So he became the High Commissioner to London. He was so popular in England that he ended up being, after he was the High Commissioner, he actually was invited to be a member of the House of Lords. This is when, and then World War I came along, and obviously he was basically Australia's man in London during that important moment. But I've got a little quote from you, Kirsty, because he was, George Reid was extremely funny and extremely witty and a magnificent speaker. He would speak at the Sydney Town Hall for an hour and a half, and everyone would just listen to every word he said. But he was an obese man, not just overweight. He was absolutely obese. And I've just got a funny little story here.
Excellent.
When he was speaking up at Newcastle, I think he said, in one particular incident, Reid's quick wit and affinity for humour were demonstrated when a heckler pointed to his ample paunch and exclaimed, "What are you going to name it, George?" Basically saying, "You're so fat, you must be pregnant."
Yes.
To which Reid replied, "Well, if it's a boy, I'll call it after myself. And if it's a girl, I'll call it Victoria. But if, as I strongly suspect, it's nothing but piss and wind, I'll name it after you."
That's gold.
That was very typical of George Reid. He was, look, there are a couple of good books out there on George Reid. He is forgotten, but hopefully the Liberal Democrats, Kirsty, can revive the greatness and the great memory of a great freedom fighter, George Reid.
That is excellent. Well, you have certainly inspired me with that story. I'm going to do some more research myself. Thanks very much, John. I'm still chuckling over that little joke. Well, we've got, there's been a few questions, actually more chats, I suppose, in there, which I know some people have already been answering. So Andrew says, and this is probably a good one for you, David, what about decommissioning old nuclear power plants, though? I read in the UK that they need to leave them for 100 years after they're turned off before they can be completely demolished. So what happens to them when they're past their use-by date?
Well, a lot of them, their use-by dates have been getting extended. So I think in the US now, they've extended the life of many nuclear plants out to 80 years. So you can run these things for a very, very long time. And when they get decommissioned, I'm not sure if they have to leave them for that long, is my understanding. But a lot of when they talk about the waste and stuff, a lot of it they just store above ground in casks and hope that they can reuse it later, because a lot of nuclear waste actually has only used about 7% of the energy potential in it, and you can reprocess it and actually recycle it. So it's a useful energy source. The only reason they don't do that is because it's more expensive than getting new uranium. But yeah, so look, I mean, you know, decommissioning any energy source actually is problematic. If you look at, you know, the very high amounts of waste from other energy sources as well, it takes a very long time to manage all that too. So, you know, like wind turbines, a lot of that is not recyclable. I think they can recycle the concrete and the steel, but the blades, I think some countries have been chopping them up and sticking them in furnaces for waste to energy. But yeah, it's.
I think we've all probably seen photos of like just big piles of them just kind of lying there as well, and they're huge.
Like I don't want to downplay it. Like you know, decommissioning a nuclear power plant is not a trivial task. It's a big deal, but at the same time, they last for extreme periods of time. So you know, 80 years.
It's also, David, I can just add that with these small modular reactors, it's a different kettle of fish. It's actually essentially just taking, you know, dismantling something. You'd be dismantling something and taking away and storing that waste. It's not the same thing as a massive plant.
Yeah, I mean, some of the proposals that companies have been, like in the inquiry that we did in Victoria, some of the proposals are for like remote mining operations. Like you can actually, you know, a small nuclear reactor, you can stick it on a truck, basically. They're that small, and use these small
subs, aren't they?
Sorry?
They're in subs, aren't they?
Yeah, well, subs are like nuclear subs do have small nuclear reactors. They keep small reactors. They talk about them as if there's some sort of new technology, but they've been using them in submarines for decades.
Yes.
But they talk about using them as an energy source for remote mining operations and this sort of thing. And you know, they're probably perfect for that, because at the moment it's all diesel, and you know, apart from pollution, diesel's very expensive. We don't refine diesel in Australia much, and we have to import a lot of it. So why not have a small reactor that can last for a long time? You don't have to refuel. I think you refuel them like once every couple of years or something. And, you know, when they're finished, you just take them away. But, you know, there's lots of, it doesn't have to be like these massive, you know, 1,000 megawatt reactors and stuff. There's lots of different technologies now that can be used for small, either mining operations or remote communities. In some places, they're looking at using them for community heating, like in cooler climates. We probably wouldn't need that in Australia, but yeah.
Well, there's a question here from Alfred saying, if you believe that climate change is not due to industrialisation, why would you support nuclear power, which could take a decade or more to build a plant, or a couple of modular ones if they are proven to be commercial, instead of pushing for several coal heli plants to generate more of electric baseload power? A lot of conservatives appear to have given up on that. However, research it. It will take a country leave a lower carbon footprint than green energies.
Oh, look, I think that's pretty straightforward to answer. It's like this. The Lib Dems policy is essentially energy agnostic. We don't want to see subsidies, distortions introduced into the market. We just want a level playing field. So if we just talk nuclear for a sec, the problem with nuclear in Australia today is it's banned. It's literally banned in the Federal Environment Act and in some state legislation as well. And so whenever you see some sort of anti-nuclear person talking, one of the lines that they do try and run is, oh, it's uneconomic. And it's very easy to answer that. So, well, look, when all we're arguing is take away the prohibition and let the market decide. And then, so going back to the question, the issue of coal, well, we'd be delighted if someone wants to put a coal-fired power plant up and they can make it stack up. They should go for their lives, you see. But there's a big problem with the energy market because solar panels and wind can provide at a point in time lower price. I mean, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Queensland, and solar farms are pumping out energy. The wholesale price plummets to nothing basically. But they're not delivering power at 1 a.m. And so the rules of the market aren't creating that level playing field. You have to be able to provide the power at a price 24/7. If that was the rule.
Well, there's a comment here more than a question from Sean saying, my only concern with nuclear is the unpredictable nature of our position in the Pacific regarding tectonic movement and increasing activity. David.
Well, my understanding is that we have very, very stable geology in Australia, some of the most stable geology in the world.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. That's why
in that respect, we're perfect for that. And like in response to what Campbell said about, the problem with nuclear is that it's banned. I can absolutely guarantee that if we're in the reverse situation where people were saying, no, we shouldn't use solar energy, we should maintain a prohibition on solar energy because it's expensive, I can guarantee I'd be campaigning to legalise solar.
Well, we do have a comment here from Trevor saying, as a geologist, I can assure you there are vast amounts of Australia that is tectonically stable.
Yeah,
so thanks for that, Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor.
So yes, a few people have said thank you to that. And how long? Someone even asked him how long, and he says for a few 100 million years, maybe.
Well, hopefully we'll have fusion reactors by then. We won't have to worry about it anymore.
You will be allowed back into the Parliament, will you?
No, I'm allowed. I'm already back in.
Oh, you're back in, of course. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now, even though John's not here, I will ask this question and I will ask him. In fact, you two might know some answers. Liz says, can you please recommend a book or two on George Reid? And I might actually message John about that one, or even Zach Gorman, as I said, that because I know he's quite an expert on all of it. So there's a few more comments in here and questions and that. I think we might be able to wrap most of those up, actually. Oh, well, one from Bede saying 5 essays on free trade by George Reid. So there you go, Liz, there's one for you to get started on. Well, panellists, thank you once again. We've got a little bit over time, but we did start a little bit late thanks to some issues with those party people in Sydney.
Can I just say one thing, just let people know that the Queensland campaign office was opened today on the south side of Brisbane at Yurong-Pili. We've had great support from a particular business. And so I just say to people, if they want to sort of volunteer to as things are gearing up to work there, if they perhaps can contact you, and it'll be passed on to Mark Horitzik, the state campaign director. Yeah, and
Yeah, I saw
good to see you
some.
there.
I saw some photos of that today, and it looks awesome, quite big as well, and a whole RAV4 stuffed full of
Well,
flyers.
our bigger challenge is to fill it with people now. We can, you know.
Exactly. Well, then I also saw the brewery across the road. So
Yeah, there's a brewery. It's near a railway station, and it's got a brewery about 100 metres from the front door. So it's optimal.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again. There's another comment here from Gail saying her second only Zoom. Thank you. So she's done very well, Gail. You've done very well to be able to survive a year and a half, and this is only your second Zoom. We've all just done so many Zooms. A lot of people saying thank you again. So we thank you to our viewers. We thank you, our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you next week with some more special guests, including the great Ross Cameron next week.
Ooh. All right.
With a time limit. I'm putting a time limit on him, though.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.